The story of Tutankhamun begins not with his death or with the legendary discovery of his tomb in the early 20th century, but with the shimmering sands of Egypt itself. Imagine yourself standing quietly beneath a star-filled sky, the air still and cool, the vast desert stretching endlessly in every direction. In the silence, only the soft whisper of the wind passes over the dunes, carrying with it echoes of thousands of years of history. The Valley of the Kings lies not far from where you stand, a place carved into barren rock, holding within it the secrets of the pharaohs. It was here, hidden beneath layers of dust and stone, that the boy king Tutankhamun rested for more than 3,000 years. Untouched by human hands, sealed away in shadows. This sense of timelessness, of history preserved almost perfectly in the heart of the desert, is where our long tale begins, slow and careful, as though each word brushes against the ancient dust itself. Tutankhamun, though one of Egypt's most famous rulers today, was a pharaoh of modest reign. He ascended to the throne as a child, barely more than a boy, around the age of 9, and ruled for just under a decade. His reign was overshadowed by powerful advisors and marked by efforts to restore the traditional gods of Egypt after his predecessor, Akhenaten's radical religious reforms. He died before reaching 20, leaving behind mysteries that would puzzle scholars for centuries. His short life seemed unremarkable compared to mighty rulers like Ramses II or Thutmose III, yet fate would make him immortal, not for what he accomplished in life, but for what his death preserved. Because his tomb was small and hidden, overlooked by ancient tomb robbers, it remained nearly intact until modern times. And within it lay treasures so dazzling that they would forever change the world's image of ancient. To imagine his burial is to step back into a world of incense and chanting priests. The golden sarcophagus gleaming in torchlight as sacred spells were recited from the Book of the Dead. The Egyptians believed deeply in the afterlife. To them, death was not an end, but a doorway into eternity. Tombs were not graves, but portals, designed to protect and guide the deceased pharaoh as he journeyed to join the gods. The care placed into these rituals was immense, and Tutankhamun's resting place, though modest by pharaonic standards, still reflected that devotion. The walls bore sacred imagery, the nested coffins glowed with precious metals, and all around were objects of daily life, gifts to help sustain him beyond the veil of mortality. Yet among the prayers and blessings, there also lingered warnings, subtle words etched by time that reminded any who might disturb such sanctity that to break the seal of the dead was to invite disaster upon the living. Centuries turned into millennia, and Tutankhamun's name was forgotten. The desert winds buried the entrance to his tomb, concealing it beneath debris and rubble from later constructions. Even the memory of where he lay faded from Egyptian lore as dynasties rose and fell, as Rome conquered Egypt, and as sands swallowed temples and villages alike. It was not until the modern age, when archaeology emerged as both science and obsession, that whispers of undiscovered tombs in the Valley of the Kings rekindled human curiosity. By the late 19th century, dozens of royal tombs had been uncovered, their treasures looted long before discovery. Yet legends persisted that one tomb's mall, hidden, untouched, still lay waiting. This tomb, some said, was that of Tutankhamun. But with legend came superstition, and the ancient warnings of curses began to stir again. Hovering over those who dared to search, Howard Carter was the man destined to find it. An English archaeologist, driven by equal measures of obsession and patience, Carter spent years in Egypt searching fruitlessly. The desert is unforgiving, and each excavation demanded enormous labor, funding, and endurance. By 1922, his benefactor Lord Carnarvon was close to withdrawing financial support after years of failure. But Carter insisted on one final season. With careful surveying and methodical excavation, his team reached an area near the tomb of Ramses VI. There, buried beneath huts from later periods, he uncovered the first step of what would lead to the greatest archaeological discovery of the century. In that moment, centuries of sand and silence gave way, and Tutankhamun's long slumber was about to end. The first steps revealed a sealed doorway marked with cartouche the oval rings of hieroglyphs enclosing a royal name. For Carter, this was the moment of destiny. Imagine the hush that fell over the workers, the soft crunch of sand beneath boots, and the glimmer of sunlight on ancient plaster as they uncovered the seal. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Beyond that doorway lay the threshold between the modern world and an untouched past. The seals were unbroken, suggesting no looter had entered. This was unheard of in the Valley of the Kings, where nearly every royal tomb had been plundered. Carter and Carnarvon knew instantly that they were standing at the edge of history, their hearts pounding as though they themselves had trespassed upon forbidden ground. On November 26, 1922, Carter peered through a small hole in the doorway, holding a candle. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, asked anxiously, "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply was simple, quiet, and immortal. Yes, wonderful things. What he saw was a treasure trove of golden shrines, chariots, statues, and relics glimmering in the dim light. Everything was as if the boy king had been laid to rest only yesterday. It was a sight so overwhelming that even hardened excavators trembled. But with the wonder came something else, a sense of trespass, as if countless unseen eyes were watching. The weight of thousands of years pressed down upon the intruders. The discovery electrified the world. Newspapers carried dramatic headlines. Photographs of gilded treasures stunned readers, and Tunkhamun instantly became a household name. Yet almost as soon as the tomb was opened, strange stories began to circulate. Rumors spread that those who entered the tomb would suffer misfortune, illness, or even death. These tales were fed not only by imagination, but also by the ancient texts themselves. Some of the objects carried inscriptions that warned of divine vengeance upon anyone who disturbed the pharaoh's eternal rest. Though historians debated whether these warnings were real or apocryphal, they stirred something deep in the human psyche, the timeless fear of violating sacred ground. The first and most famous victim, many said, was Lord Carnarvon himself. Only a few months after the opening of the tomb, in April 1923, Carnarvon died suddenly in Cairo from a mosquito bite that had become infected. The bite festered, leading to blood poisoning. His death shocked the world and seemed to confirm the whispered curse. Newspapers seized the story, spinning tales of Pharaoh's vengeance, of lights in Cairo going out at the moment of his death, of his dog howling and dying far away in England at the exact same time. Whether coincidence or something more, the legend of the curse took root, spreading as quickly as the news of the discovery itself. Carter, however, dismissed such superstitions. A pragmatic man, he focused on the painstaking process of cataloging and conserving the thousands of artifacts from the tomb. Each object was carefully examined, recorded, and removed for preservation. Yet even Carter could not deny that strange accidents and illnesses seemed to follow many who were connected with the excavation. Some died young, others fell gravely ill without explanation. These stories, while often exaggerated by the press, fed the aura of dread. The idea of a curse was too compelling, too irresistible to ignore, especially when it echoed the solemn warnings carved into Egyptian tombs thousands of years before. It is easy, lying here now, to let the imagination wander as it must have in 1923. Close your eyes and picture. The flicker of lantern light against walls painted with gods and demons, the heavy scent of dust mixed with the faint sweetness of ancient resin, the sound of voices hushed in awe. Imagine the silence when the explorers left the chamber each evening, the treasures resting once more in darkness, as though the tomb itself waited patiently for the next intrusion. Such moments stir a primal sense of respect and unease, for deep within, humans have always feared disturbing the dead. And perhaps, just perhaps, there are mysteries that were never meant to be revealed. Thus begins the tale of Tutankhamun's curse, a story not merely of death and misfortune, but of humanity's eternal fascination with the unknown. Was it truly a curse, or a series of coincidences magnified by eager imaginations? Did the ancient Egyptians weave protections into their tombs that echo across time? Or is the curse a reflection of our own fears, projected onto events we struggle to explain? These questions have lingered for a century, and they will follow us as we continue this long journey. For now, rest gently in the knowledge that you are safe, listening only to the soft unfolding of history, as the Boy King's story drifts onward like a dream carried by desert winds. The death of Lord Carnarvon cast a long shadow over the discovery, and though Carter worked tirelessly to suppress the talk of curses, the story took on a life of its own. Reporters thrived on sensationalism, and the exotic setting of ancient Egypt offered fertile ground for myth. The idea that the pharaoh's tomb was protected by forces beyond comprehension was irresistible. Soon, every misfortune, no matter how small, that befell anyone remotely associated with the excavation was attributed to Tutankhamun's wrath. Some who had never even set foot in Egypt, but who had financial or political ties to the discovery, found themselves dragged into the narrative of the curse. In this way, reality and legend intertwined, until it became impossible to separate fact from fear, history from haunting. The Egyptians themselves had always taken their tombs seriously. Inscriptions and carvings often warned that those who trespassed upon the resting places of the dead would be punished by the gods. In a culture that believed deeply in the continuity of life after death, such threats were not symbolic, but literal. To disturb a tomb was to break a sacred covenant between the living and the dead. Modern archaeology, with its chisels and brushes, no place for such beliefs. Yet even seasoned scholars could not help but feel the weight of centuries pressing down on them. As they crossed thresholds meant to remain sealed forever, the Valley of the Kings, beautiful in its barren silence, seemed to echo with these warnings, and the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb only amplified the sensation that the explorers were walking on forbidden ground. The press recounted tales of visitors to the tomb feeling sudden chills, of shadows that seemed to move in the flickering lamplight, of the heavy oppressive air that clung to the chambers. It was said that Carter's own canary was killed by a cobra, the snake slithering into its cage as if to symbolize the return of Egypt's ancient symbols of protection. Cobras had long been sacred, associated with the goddess Wadjet, the protector of pharaohs. The death of the bird at such a moment was taken by many as an omen. In truth, snakes were common in Egypt, and coincidences were inevitable. But within the charged atmosphere of the discovery, every event became a sign, every misstep a confirmation of the curse. More deaths followed in the years after Carnarvon's. A close associate, George J. Gould, fell ill shortly after visiting the tomb and died soon after. Another, Prince Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey of Egypt, was murdered in London under scandalous circumstances. Arthur Mace, who had worked on cataloging the tomb's contents, grew sick and never recovered. The list seemed to grow, each name added to the grim tally whispered in the papers and among the public. Although modern scholars would later point out that many who were directly involved lived long. Healthy lives, including Howard Carter himself, who died peacefully many years later, the image of a mounting curse was too compelling to dismiss. For those who believed, it was clear, the pharaoh's spirit had been disturbed, and vengeance had been unleashed. Yet even as these tales spread, Carter himself remained calm, focused, and methodical. The sheer scale of the find demanded decades of work. Tutankhamen's tomb contained more than 5,000 artifacts, each one delicate, each one needing careful preservation. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, now one of the most recognized symbols of ancient Egypt, was only one piece among thousands. Beds carved into the shapes of sacred animals, statues of deities, boxes filled with jewelry, weapons, musical instruments, and even jars of wine, all these had to be studied and preserved. Carter's devotion to this task was remarkable, and perhaps in his pragmatism, he found a shield against the talk of curses. That even he could not entirely silence the rumors, for each new death breathed life into the legend once more. As the treasures were removed from the tomb, they began to travel across the world. Museums displayed them to captivated audiences, and Tutankhamun became a global icon. His golden mask gleamed under modern lights, drawing millions to gaze upon the face of a boy who had ruled 3,000 years before. And still, whispers of the curse followed wherever the treasures went. Some claimed that curators fell ill, that accidents haunted exhibitions, that those who gazed too long upon the relics carried with them a shadow of the ancient malediction. These claims, however unsubstantiated, spoke less to reality than to the power of human imagination. The curse had become more than a superstition. It was now part of the very identity of Tutankhamun's story. To understand why such legends took root, one must reflect on the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians themselves. Death was not final, but transformative, and the preservation of the body and spirit was of utmost importance. The Ka, or life force, and the Ba, the personality, were believed to continue beyond death, sustained by offerings and rituals. Tombs were carefully constructed not only as resting places, but as sacred machines for eternity, combining architecture, art, and spiritual texts to ensure safe passage into the afterlife. To disturb this balance was, in their eyes, to invite cosmic disorder. Whether or not one believes in curses, it is undeniable that the ancient Egyptians approached death with a seriousness that resonates even today. And to tread into their tombs is to step into that worldview. Archaeology, for all its science, is also an act of storytelling. Each brush of dust reveals not just an object, but a narrative stretching across time. Tutankhamun's tomb, unlike so many others, offered an almost complete story, one that had been sealed away, untouched. To break that seal was to bring the story into the modern world, but also to fracture it, for the tomb was no longer whole. Its treasures were scattered, its sanctity broken. For some, this fracture itself was the curse knot, a supernatural force. But the inevitable sorrow that comes when sacred silence is violated. Perhaps the real malediction was the reminder that humanity cannot take without consequence. That in uncovering secrets meant to remain hidden, we also invite burdens we do not fully understand. And so the legend of the curse grew alongside the fame of the treasures. Visitors to the Valley of the Kings often reported feeling a peculiar weight in the air, as though the barren cliffs themselves watched with silent judgment. The desert, after all, has always been a place of mystery. In its endless expanse, time feels stretched, history compressed into layers of sand and stone. To walk those paths is to feel the presence of countless souls who once lived, worshipped, and were buried there. It is little wonder, then, that when tragedy struck those connected to the tomb, people turned to the idea of a curse. The desert had given up its secret, but perhaps it had demanded a price. Howard Carter's own reflections suggest a man who never believed in the curse, but who nonetheless respected the culture he studied. He often wrote of the haunting beauty of the tomb, of the awe he felt upon entering chambers filled with untouched treasures. Yet in his notes, there was also a sense of unease, a recognition that he had trespassed upon a sacred space. Even without belief in supernatural vengeance, one could not stand in that place without feeling the gravity of what had been disturbed. The ancient Egyptians had built these resting places to last for eternity, and Carter knew well that eternity had been interrupted by his own hand. As the years passed and the treasures of Tutankhamun traveled across oceans, the story of the curse became inseparable from the boy king's identity. Some dismissed it as superstition, others embraced it as proof of forces beyond human comprehension. In truth, the curse, whether real or imagined, reveals something deeper: the human need to find meaning in misfortune, to weave mystery into history, to believe that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed without consequence. And in the quiet hours, when one reflects on the flickering lantern light that first revealed the golden mask, it is difficult not to feel that same unease, that same sense of being watched by eyes that no longer live. The story continues, as it must. For Tutankhamun's tomb is not merely about treasures or curses, but about the eternal dance between life and death, between discovery and reverence. The valley still lies under the same silent sky. The cliffs still guard their secrets, and the boy king's memory still drifts through the desert air. As we journey deeper into this tale, we follow not just the deaths and misfortunes that gave rise to the legend, but also the beliefs, the rituals, and the living world of ancient Egypt that shaped them. The sands shift, the stars watch, and the story moves quietly forward, guiding us deeper into the mysteries of a civilization that has never truly released its hold on the human imagination. The Valley of the Kings, where Tutankhamun lay hidden, is more than just a graveyard of kings. It is a place where the living world meets the eternal, carved into the limestone cliffs west of the Nile. Standing there, one is struck not only by the silence, but by the knowledge that beneath every footstep lies centuries of devotion, labor, and belief. The Egyptians had chosen this valley for its isolation, a place where tombs could be dug deep into the rock, away from the reach of looters. Yet the valley was never truly empty. Priests came to make offerings, workers carved and painted chambers, families remembered their ancestors. It was a place alive with ritual, even as it was built for death. To disturb such a place was to step into a world where the line between the living and the dead had always been thin, a line that Carter and his team unknowingly crossed when they broke the seals of the Boy King's resting place. As word of the supposed curse spread, the valley itself became a character in the unfolding tale. Visitors spoke of strange feelings as though unseen presences lingered among the tombs. Guides whispered stories of shadows moving across walls where no light should cast them, of sudden gusts of wind that seemed to breathe from within the earth. Whether imagination or something more, these sensations only added weight to the belief that the valley held power, a power that resisted intrusion. In the evenings, as the sun set behind the cliffs and the desert cooled, it was not difficult to believe that the spirits of Pharaoh still lingered in their subterranean halls, watching, waiting, perhaps judging those who had disturbed their eternal rest. The deaths connected to Tutankhamun's tomb became a litany, repeated across continents. Richard Bethel, Carter's personal secretary, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Lord Westbury, who had been involved with the artifacts, fell to his death from a building in London. Rumors swirled that a note had been left behind, alluding to the curse. Others, including members of excavation teams and their relatives, died suddenly or tragically, feeding the ever-growing list of victims. Each name was added like a tally on a parchment, and the curse became not just a whisper, but a global obsession. Newspapers in Europe and America seized on every story, amplifying the legend until it seemed undeniable that the Boy King's spirit was reaching across time to exact vengeance. And yet, when examined closely, many of these stories dissolve under scrutiny. The number of people who worked in or around the tomb numbered in the dozens, if not hundreds, and most of them lived long lives. Howard Carter himself lived nearly 2 decades after the discovery, quietly continuing his work until his death from natural causes. Yet facts did little to sway belief, for humans are not always guided by logic when faced with mystery. A single untimely death could outweigh a dozen peaceful lives in the eyes of the public. For stories of vengeance and curses capture the imagination far more than ordinary endings. In this sense, the curse became not a reflection of truth, but of the way people chose to see the events unfolding around them. It is important to remember that the very concept of a curse was deeply Egyptian. Inscriptions from tombs often warned of divine punishment for those who violated the sacred space. One such inscription from another tomb in Saqqara warned, "All people who enter this tomb, impure, there will be judgment. An end shall be made for them." To the ancient Egyptians, such words were not idle threats. They believed the gods themselves would enforce these protections, ensuring that the journey of the deceased to the afterlife would remain undisturbed. When modern people encountered these warnings, they carried with them centuries of superstition. Ready to blend the ancient with the contemporary, the myth with the headline, the treasures themselves carried an aura of enchantment. The golden mask, with its serene features, seemed almost alive under the glow of electric lamps. The eyes of statues appeared to follow the viewer, their gaze unblinking and eternal. The chariots, the amulets, the jewelry, all these bore the weight of ritual. Each object designed with symbolic meaning to aid the pharaoh's passage to eternity. When taken out of the tomb, placed in glass cases, and shown to the public, they retained that aura, sense of belonging to a world that was never meant to mingle with ours. For some, this alone was proof that to possess or disturb them was to invite misfortune. For such objects had not been made for mortal hands, but for divine purpose. Even today, visitors to exhibitions of Tutankhamun's treasures often describe a peculiar feeling, a hushed reverence, as though the objects command silence. Museums report that crowds naturally lower their voices, drawn into a state of awe. It is as if the ancient rituals still cling to the artifacts, whispering softly through time. Perhaps this is why the idea of a curse persists. For even stripped of supernatural claims, there is no denying the power these relics hold over the imagination. They are more than art. They are conduits of belief, carved with intention, saturated with meaning. To look upon them is to brush against the edges of a world where life, death, and eternity flowed seamlessly together. As the 20th century moved forward, scholars tried to dismiss the curse as a myth, pointing to natural explanations for each death. Mosquitoes carried disease, accidents claimed lives, and coincidence played its part. Yet the curse endured because it was not truly about evidence. It was about mystery, about the unease that comes from breaking into places meant to be sealed forever. In this way, the curse belongs not only to Tutankhamun's tomb, but to every human culture that has wrestled with the boundary between life and death. Across the world, from China to South America, stories abound of spirits guarding graves, of ancestors avenging disrespect. The Egyptian curse is but one chapter in a global story of reverence and fear for the dead. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun himself remains an enigma. His life was brief, and much about him is still shrouded in uncertainty. Was his death natural, or was it hastened by illness or accident? Modern scans of his mummy reveal signs of malaria, a broken leg, and possible congenital defects. Perhaps the result of inbreeding within the royal family? His reign, though short, restored the traditional gods and stabilized Egypt after Akhenaten's upheaval. In many ways, he was a child caught in the tides of history, a boy whose fate was written long before he could shape it. And yet, in death, he became more powerful than any pharaoh before him. For his story endures not because of what he did, but because of how he was found and the legends that grew in his wake. Howard Carter, writing in his later years, reflected on the discovery as both triumph and burden. He had achieved what countless explorers dreamed of, uncovering an intact pharaoh's tomb, but he had also become the custodian of a legend he could never escape. His meticulous notes reveal a man torn between pride and unease, between the excitement of discovery and the knowledge that he had unleashed something beyond archaeology. Whether he acknowledged it openly or not, he must have known that the world would never see Tutankhamun as just another pharaoh. The boy king had become immortal, not through temples or monuments, but through the golden mask, the treasures, and the curse whispered in darkened rooms across the globe. As time passed, the curse grew into popular culture. It inspired novels, films, and endless retellings, shaping the very image of ancient Egypt in the modern mind. The mummy's curse became a trope, a story retold so many times that it transcended its origin, and in each telling, Tutankhamun's legend grew larger. Even skeptics could not deny that something about the tomb's discovery tapped into a universal human fear. That the dead might not rest quietly if disturbed, that the past still has power over the present. The boy king, who had been forgotten for centuries, now reigned once more, not as a ruler of Egypt, but as a symbol of mystery, beauty, and dread. And so, the story moves forward, flowing like the Nile itself, steady, winding, eternal. The curse, whether real or imagined, is but one part of a larger tapestry woven from history, superstition, and wonder.
Ice.
As we drift deeper into this tale, we leave behind the sensational headlines and step further into the heart of ancient Egypt itself, into the temples and rituals that shaped a civilization obsessed with eternity. The valley still waits in silence, the stars still watch above, and Tutankhamun's shadow lingers, guiding us onward into the mysteries of a land where death was never an end, but a beginning. To understand why the tomb of Tutankhamun inspired both awe and dread, we must step back into the spiritual world of the ancient Egyptians. Their entire civilization revolved around the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, a rhythm as constant as the rising of the Nile. They saw the world as infused with divine presence, where gods walked beside men, and where the afterlife was as real and tangible as the desert sand beneath their feet. Death was not feared as annihilation, but respected as transformation, a doorway through which every soul would pass. To prepare for that passage was the duty of both rich and poor. Though for a pharaoh, the preparations were on a scale so magnificent that they still astonish us thousands of years later. At the heart of this belief was the idea of the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was the life force, the essence of vitality that needed sustenance even after death, which is why food, wine, and offerings were left in tombs. The Ba was the personality, often depicted as a bird with a human face, able to move between the realm of the living and the dead. At night, it was believed, the Ba could leave the body and wander, only to return by morning. For the pharaoh, the Ka and Ba were supported not only by offerings but by elaborate rituals, prayers, and objects crafted with deep symbolism. Tutankhamun's tomb was filled with such objects, each one a tool for eternity. When these were disturbed, The ancient Egyptians would have believed the very balance of the king's afterlife was endangered, and vengeance might follow as a cosmic correction. The gods themselves were guardians of this eternal journey. Osiris, lord of the underworld, stood as the judge of the dead. He had once been a king himself, betrayed and slain by his brother Set, only to be resurrected through the devotion of his wife Isis. His story became the model for every pharaoh, for in death, the king was believed to unite with Osiris and rule forever in the afterlife. To disturb a pharaoh's tomb was to interfere with that sacred process, to risk angering not only the spirit of the king but the gods who oversaw his passage. And so, even if the inscriptions in Tutankhamun's tomb did not directly name a curse, the very presence of Osiris and the protective gods carved on the walls carried with them an implicit warning. This space was holy, and holiness, once violated, would demand redress. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, also loomed large in this belief. He was the protector of tombs, the guide of souls, the one who weighed the heart of the deceased against the feather of truth. Priests wearing jackal masks once performed rituals in his honor as they anointed the body, sealed the wrappings, and prepared the soul for its long journey. In Tutankhamun's tomb, a statue of Anubis was found, crouched like a watchful guardian, its gaze fixed as though it had been waiting all those centuries for intruders. For Carter and his team, this statue was simply one more artifact. But to the Egyptians, it would have been a warning. Anubis sees all, and no trespass escapes his notice. Beside the gods, the Egyptians employed written magic in the form of spells. The Book of the Dead, a collection of hymns and prayers, was often included in burials, guiding the deceased through the trials of the underworld. These texts contained instructions for passing through gates guarded by demons, for speaking the correct words of power, for surviving the weighing of the heart. They were more than literature, or spells that lived on, their power enduring as long as the words were spoken or remembered. In this sense, Tutankhamun's tomb was a treasury of magic as much as of gold. And when modern hands broke the seals, those ancient words seemed to awaken, not in literal power, perhaps, but in the imagination of all who heard of them. The curse became an extension of those spells, a modern echo of ancient fears. Ritual, too, played its part. When Tutankhamun's body was interred, priests would have performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, a sacred act believed to restore the senses of the deceased so he could see, hear, and eat in the afterlife. Hymns would have been sung, incense burned, and libations poured. The walls of the tomb were not simply decoration but sacred maps of eternity. Every symbol, every figure painted on plaster was designed to guide and protect. When Carter's team stepped into those chambers, they did not just uncover art. They entered a space deliberately constructed as a bridge between worlds. To the ancient mind, such a bridge was not to be crossed by the uninvited. That, too, is why the curse gained such traction. It spoke to the violation of boundaries set by gods and reinforced by ritual. Even the positioning of the tomb itself carried meaning. Nestled in the valley of the kings, Tutankhamun's burial chamber was aligned with celestial movements. The Egyptians were master astronomers, and they saw the stars not merely as lights in the sky, but as gods and spirits. To be buried beneath their gaze was to be woven into the fabric of eternity. The tomb, then, was not only a resting place, but a cosmic engine, a place where heaven and earth met. To intrude upon such a place was to disrupt not only the peace of the dead, but the balance of the cosmos itself. Small wonder, then, that when death struck those connected to the excavation, people were ready to believe that the disturbance had rippled outward, drawing down misfortune as naturally as night follows day. The priests who once tended to these burials must have understood this danger, which is why they so often inscribed warnings. While no dramatic inscription was found over Tutankhamun's doorway, proclaiming death to trespassers, other tombs in Egypt carried exactly such messages. One, uncovered centuries before Carter's find, declared that anyone who disturbed the tomb would be consumed by crocodiles, hippopotamuses, and lions. The language may sound poetic, but its intent was clear: to ward off intruders by promising a violent end. When modern explorers like Carter entered Tutankhamun's resting place, they stepped into a world where such threats had once been taken literally. That memory lingered in the collective consciousness, ready to revive itself in the form of a curse. The blending of ancient belief and modern misfortune created the perfect storm for legend. Each tragic death became proof, each strange occurrence a sign. When Lord Carnarvon's dog supposedly died at the very hour of his master's passing, it was seen not as coincidence, but as synchronicity, the curse reaching across continents. When others fell ill or perished, the stories grew ever darker. But beneath these tales lay a deeper truth. The curse, whether supernatural or not, spoke to something timeless in the human spirit, the recognition that some places, some mysteries, are too sacred to disturb without consequence. In many ways, Tutankhamun's curse was less about the boy king himself and more about what his tomb represented, the endurance of Egypt's spiritual world across millennia. For a civilization so deeply devoted to eternity, the violation of a tomb was more than robbery or discovery. It was a disruption of the cosmic order. That idea, buried with the pharaohs, survived in whispers until Carter's excavation gave it voice again. The curse, then, was not simply a newspaper invention, nor merely a superstition, but an echo of ancient belief, a resonance that still lingers in the modern imagination. As we reflect upon these layers of myth, ritual, and tragedy, it becomes clear that the story of Tutankhamun's tomb cannot be reduced to a single dimension. It is not only about strange deaths, nor only about dazzling treasures. It is about the meeting of two worlds, the ancient and the modern, the sacred and the scientific. When Carter entered the tomb, he carried with him the light of electric lamps, the tools of archaeology, the notebooks of scholars. But he also stepped into a place designed for gods and spirits, filled with the silence of 3,000 years. In that moment, the modern world and the ancient collided, and out of that collision, the legend of the curse was born. And so, the story flows onward, like the Nile winding through its eternal course. Tutankhamun's mask still gazes out with serene eyes. Anubis still crouches watchfully in the dark, and Osiris still waits in judgment. The curse whispers quietly beneath it all, reminding us that the past is never entirely gone, that the dead are never entirely silent. As we drift deeper into this tale, we leave behind the rituals of the tomb and turn once more to the human lives touched by its discovery, to the strange fates and untimely ends that gave the curse its enduring power in the modern age. As the years unfolded after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, the roll call of names tied to tragedy grew longer, each one strengthening the belief that the boy king's spirit had been disturbed. Lord Carnarvon's death had set the stage, but it was the string of misfortunes that followed which carved the curse into legend. Among them was George J. Gould, wealthy American financier who visited the tomb in 1923. Shortly afterward, he fell ill with a fever and died suddenly. To many, his fate seemed like proof that even a brief encounter with the tomb carried danger. As though the shadow of Tutankhamun reached out to claim him, skeptics pointed to natural illness. But for those enchanted by the legend, coincidence was no longer a convincing explanation. Another name often whispered in connection with the curse was that of Richard Bethel, Howard Carter's personal secretary. Bethel had been responsible for cataloging many of the treasures, handling the golden relics and sacred objects with care. In 1929, only a few years after the excavation, he was found dead in his bed in a London club, suffocated under suspicious circumstances. The suddenness of his death, combined with his close connection to the artifacts, made him an ideal candidate for the curse's supposed reach. Newspapers suggested darkly that he had been strangled by the pharaoh's hand, weaving his death seamlessly into the tapestry of vengeance. The death of Lord Westbury added further fuel. He was the father of one of Carter's staff who had died earlier, and soon after, he himself fell from a high building in London. Accounts reported that before his fall, he left a note expressing despair. Rumors swirled that he felt haunted by his involvement with the tomb, as if he could not escape its pull. To those who believed, the manner of his death seemed another eerie confirmation that Tutankhamun's spirit worked its retribution across oceans and years. Rational minds pointed to depression and misfortune, but in the public's imagination, the curse claimed yet another victim. Not all deaths tied to the curse were direct. Some relatives of those connected to the excavation died young or suffered strange illnesses, and the curse grew by association. Prince Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey of Egypt, who had connections to Lord Carnarvon, was murdered in London under scandalous circumstances. Though his death had nothing to do with the tomb itself, it was nonetheless added to the list. The logic of the curse was not strict but expansive. Once a person was even loosely tied to the discovery, their fate could be woven into the legend. In this way, the curse became elastic, stretching to include tragedies that would otherwise have been forgotten. Arthur Mace, a skilled archaeologist who worked alongside Carter, also fell ill and died before completing his work. His sickness dragged on, leaving him weakened until death claimed him. To colleagues, it was the sad end of a hard-working man, but to the public, it was another tally under the curse. The truth that illness and mortality were common in a world without modern medicine mattered little. What mattered was the story, and the story demanded victims. Each obituary became another verse in the hymn of fear that surrounded the tomb. Even animals were not exempt from the legend. Carter's canary, killed by a cobra, had already become a symbol of ominous fate. Later tales claimed that other animals linked to those involved in the excavation met strange ends, further convincing people that the curse was indiscriminate, striking at all who trespassed, whether directly or indirectly. These smaller, stranger stories added texture to the myth, making it feel less like isolated events and more like a pattern of unseen design. Yet through it all, Howard Carter himself remained untouched. He lived for many years after the excavation, cataloging and preserving Tutankhamun's treasures, eventually dying peacefully in 1939 at the age of 64. To skeptics, Carter's long life was the ultimate proof that the curse was nothing but superstition. If anyone should have been its first victim, it was the man who opened the tomb, peered inside, and disturbed its sacred balance, and yet he endured. But to believers, even Carter's survival was explained away. Perhaps, they suggested, the boy king's spirit respected Carter's devotion, sparing him in gratitude. Or perhaps the curse was patient, waiting until the work was complete before allowing its final witness to depart this world. The persistence of the curse lay not only in deaths, but in the way these events were told. Newspapers sensationalized every connection, stringing together tragedies into a narrative that captured the public imagination. In the 1920s and 1930s, Egyptology was a glamorous subject, mixing exotic adventure with scientific discovery. The curse added drama to this spectacle, giving it the flavor of myth and mystery. Readers across Europe and America devoured the stories, not because they were proven, but because they were haunting. In smoky parlors and crowded people whispered about the pharaoh's vengeance, shivering as though they too had stepped into the dark tomb beneath the desert. Psychologists might say that the curse functioned as a mirror of human fear. In a time of rapid modernization, when electricity and machines were transforming life, the ancient tomb reminded people of forces older and deeper beyond the reach of science. Death was still a familiar companion, and superstition clung tightly where reason faltered. The curse gave shape to that fear, turning random misfortunes into a story that felt purposeful. It was easier to believe in the wrath of a long-dead king than to accept the randomness of mortality. In this way, the curse was not only a legend, but a comfort, offering a narrative that made sense of the senseless. For Egyptians of the early 20th century, the curse carried additional weight. Many saw the tomb's discovery as yet another act of Western intrusion, a foreign hand reaching into their heritage. The curse, then, was justice's spiritual retaliation against those who took what was not theirs. Whether or not the deaths were linked, the idea that Egypt itself, through its gods and pharaohs, was defending its treasures resonated with national pride. In that sense, the curse was more than superstition. It was resistance, an assertion that the ancient land still had power over its destiny, even under colonial eyes. And so the list of names continued, blending fact and fiction until they became inseparable. Gould, Bethel, Westbury, Mace, Carnarvon all were woven into the myth, their lives and deaths now part of the boy king's story. Each new tragedy was a reminder that the past does not sleep quietly, that to disturb the silence of eternity is to risk awakening forces beyond comprehension. Whether those forces were divine, psychological, or coincidental mattered little. What mattered was the tale, and the tale whispered through every shadow of the Valley of the Kings. Carried on the winds that sweep across the desert, timeless and unrelenting. As we drift deeper into this story, The line between reality and legend grows ever thinner. The curse has become inseparable from Tutankhamun's name, yet behind it lies a civilization of astonishing depth, its gods, its rituals, its monuments, all speaking to a worldview that treated eternity as the most precious treasure of all. To continue our journey, we must leave behind the tally of deaths for a time and turn our gaze back to Egypt itself, to the Nile that sustained it, the temples that honored its gods, and the people who lived their lives in the shadow of both sun and eternity. For it is in this wider context that Tutankhamun's story truly breathes, and it is within this landscape that the legend of the curse finds its deepest roots. To walk through ancient Egypt in the time of Tutankhamun was to inhabit a world inextricably tied to the rhythms of the Nile. That mighty river was more than water. It was the pulse of the land, the dividing line between life and death, between fertility and desolation. Each year the Nile flooded, depositing rich black silt upon the fields, a gift from the gods that sustained crops of barley and wheat. Villages blossomed along its banks, their mud brick houses clustered in harmony with the cycle of planting and harvest. Without the Nile, there would be only desert and silence.
Out with it.
Egypt became a cradle of civilization, a place where kings built monuments to eternity and farmers prayed for the steady return of the waters. To the people of Tutankhamun's time, the river was not merely natural, it was divine. Daily life in this world moved with a slow, steady rhythm. Farmers rose with the sun, guiding plows drawn by oxen, while fishermen cast their nets from red boats into the gentle currents. Women ground grain into flour, baked bread in clay ovens, and brewed beer, the staple drink of rich and poor alike. Children played in the dust, or learned their trades from their parents. Scribes, respected for their knowledge, bent over papyrus scrolls, writing carefully with reed pens dipped in ink. Priests tended temples, merchants carried goods along the river, and soldiers trained in case the pharaoh called upon them. It was a society both simple and intricate, each person part of a grand design that revolved around the king, the gods, and the eternal promise of life after death. The temples of Egypt towered above the landscape, their pylons and obelisks carved with hieroglyphs that sang praises to the gods. At Karnak, at Luxor, and at smaller shrines across the land, priests conducted rituals to maintain Ma'at, the balance of the cosmos. Incense smoke curled into the air, hymns echoed through stone halls, and offerings of food, flowers, and perfumes were laid before statues of the gods. These temples were not mere places of worship, but engines of eternity, sustaining the harmony that kept Nile waters flowing, sun rising, and life continuing. For Tutankhamun, as pharaoh, his role was to act as the living bridge between the divine and mortal worlds, ensuring that order triumphed over chaos. Even as a boy king, this sacred responsibility defined him. Within this tapestry of life, death was ever present, yet never final. Families honored ancestors, leaving offerings at small shrines or at tombs in desert necropolises. Ordinary burials, though far humbler than those of kings, still reflected the hope of eternity. Simple shroud, a few amulets, a jar of food or beer, these were gifts for the journey beyond. The wealthy prepared more elaborate tombs, commissioning coffins painted with protective spells, or placing shabby figurines beside the deceased. Small servants meant to labor on behalf of their master in the fields of the afterlife. This devotion to preparation reveals why the violation of a tomb, no matter how small, was such a profound disturbance. It was not theft of goods alone, but disruption of eternity itself. Tutankhamun's reign came at a fragile moment in Egyptian history. His predecessor Akhenaten had appended centuries of tradition by abolishing the worship of most gods in favor of a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk. Temples were closed, priests displaced, and the old order shaken. By the time Tutankhamun ascended the throne, Egypt yearned for restoration. The boy king, guided by his advisors, reopened temples, reinstated the old gods, and sought to heal the fractures left by his father's revolution. In this sense, Tutankhamun's reign, though brief, was deeply symbolic, a return to balance, a reassertion of the timeless rhythms of Nile and cosmos. This act of restoration only deepened the sanctity of his burial, for he had been the pharaoh who brought back the gods. The grandeur of temples and rituals was matched by the grandeur of the tombs themselves. Carved deep into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, they were architectural marvels, filled with passages and chambers painted in dazzling color. Scenes from the Book of the Dead lined the walls, solar barges sailing across the heavens, gods weighing the hearts of mortals, serpents and guardians barring the way, and pharaohs triumphant in eternity. These images were not decoration, but magic in pigment and stone, alive with purpose. To gaze upon them, even now, is to feel their power. For the ancient Egyptians, to trespass upon these images without permission was to trespass upon the sacred itself. This, too, is why the curse found fertile ground. It drew upon the very real awe that such places inspire. While villagers tilled their fields and priests chanted their hymns, artisans devoted their lives to crafting the treasures of the tombs. Goldsmiths hammered delicate amulets shaped like scarabs, symbols of rebirth. Jewelers strung beads of lapis lazuli and carnelian into necklaces that gleamed with the colors of the gods. Woodworkers carved beds, chairs, and chests, each inlaid with ivory and gold. Every object had meaning: a dagger to protect the king, a boat to carry him on celestial waters, a statue to embody divine presence. Tutankhamun's tomb, filled with such splendor, represented the highest art of his age, and its disturbance felt like an affront not only to religion, but to generations of human labor and devotion. The Egyptians saw themselves as living in harmony with a universe sustained by ritual. Each dawn, when the sun rose, it was proof that the prayers of priests and the devotion of the people had succeeded once again in ensuring order. Each flood of the Nile confirmed that the balance of Manat endured. In such a worldview, every action had consequence, every ritual weight. A curse, then, was not superstition, but logic. If balance were broken, disorder must follow. When Carter and his team broke the seal of Tutankhamun's tomb, they did not just disturb a burial, they symbolically disrupted the cosmic order. For believers, strange deaths that followed were not accidents, but the inevitable result of disorder rippling outward from that moment. This deep spiritual framework made the story of the curse all the more believable. Western audiences, fascinated by Egypt's exotic allure, latched onto the idea with eagerness, but Egyptians themselves needed no persuasion. They knew, in their cultural memory, that tombs were powerful, that the dead did not rest passively, but actively participated in the balance of the world. For them, the curse was not fantasy, but continuity, a reminder that the gods of the Nile still watched, still judged, still punished those who transgressed. In this way, the legend was both a product of Western imagination and an echo of ancient truth. Rooted in a worldview where eternity was the highest reality, the Nile, the temples, the tombs, the fields, all were bound together in a single vision of life and death. To the farmer sowing grain, the scribe recording taxes, the soldier standing guard, and the priest offering incense, eternity was always close at hand. Tutankhamun's tomb was not an isolated monument, but part of this living system. The final resting place of a boy who, despite his youth, had been Pharaoh, mediator between gods and men. To violate his chamber was to wound that system, to break the harmony. Whether real or imagined, the curse reflected this wound, a scar left by the clash between ancient eternity and modern intrusion. And so, the daily life of Egypt, sustained by river and ritual, shaped the soil from which the legend of the curse grew. It was not born from thin air, but from thousands of years of devotion to the dead, to gods who demanded respect, to a worldview in which the past never vanished, but remained active, present, eternal. The curse was not superstition alone, but the natural extension of beliefs that had once governed every action along the Nile. In this way, Tutankhamun's story is more than archaeology. It is a mirror of the civilization that created him, a reminder that in Egypt, death was never the end. And so our journey continues, moving gently from the riverbanks and temples back into the silence of the Valley of the Kings. The people of Egypt lived their lives in rhythm with eternity, but the tombs remind us that eternity has its guardians. As we follow the thread of this story, we return once more to the strange fate of those who touched the treasures, to the eerie accidents and whispered deaths that modern minds cannot fully explain. For even as we understand the daily life of Egypt, the curse still lingers like a shadow on the sand, waiting to remind us that the pharaoh's silence was never meant to be broken. As the years passed after 1922, The curse of Tutankhamun did not fade away, only grew stronger. Each new death, each unexplained illness, each tragic accident that touched those linked to the tomb was folded into the legend, adding to its power. Newspapers in London, New York, and Cairo were relentless, publishing stories that blurred fact with embellishment. Headlines declared that the pharaoh's vengeance was real, that the dead had reached beyond the veil of centuries to punish the living. The truth of these accounts mattered little. What mattered was the story itself, and the story was irresistible. The boy king, once forgotten, had become the most famous pharaoh in history, and it was the curse as much as the treasures that sealed his immortality in the modern mind. Among the names that continued to be linked with tragedy was that of Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who had been the first to examine Tutankhamun's mummy with X-rays in 1924. Shortly after, he fell ill and died under mysterious circumstances. For the public, the connection was obvious. He had peered too deeply into the body of the pharaoh. The curse had claimed him. Another was a sea mace, who had worked alongside Carter cataloging artifacts. He, too, died suddenly after a lingering illness. To the rational mind, these were unfortunate coincidences in a time when medicine could do little against infection or disease. But in the world's imagination, they were offerings to the curse. Proof that none who touched the sacred body of the boy king would escape untouched. The myth extended even further, wrapping its tendrils around the families of those involved. Stories circulated of relatives dying young, of servants struck down by accidents, of financial ruin haunting heirs of the expedition. In truth, some of these tales were fabrications or exaggerations, spun by newspapers eager to captivate their readers. Yet once told, they became part of the larger story, impossible to unravel from fact. The curse was no longer simply about Tutankhamun's tomb, had become a living myth, one that shaped how people thought about archaeology, about death, and about the dangers of uncovering the past. It is worth remembering that the early 20th century was a time deeply fascinated by the occult and the supernatural. Spiritualism and ghost stories filled parlors in Europe and America. The discovery of a nearly intact pharaoh's tomb in the desert seemed to confirm that the ancient world was still alive, that its powers still lingered. Writers seized upon the curse, weaving it into novels, stage plays, and eventually films. The idea of a mummy rising from the tomb to take vengeance was born in this era, an echo of the real stories told about Tutankhamun's curse. What began as superstition became an enduring part of popular culture, shaping how the world would forever imagine Egypt's ancient dead. Even as scholars dismissed the curse, they could not deny the weight of the legend. Museums that displayed Tutankhamun's treasures reported hushed whispers among visitors, as though fear and awe accompanied the golden mask wherever it traveled. In the 1970s, when the treasures toured the world, millions came to gaze upon them, and the old whispers of the curse stirred again. Some claimed that accidents plagued the exhibitions, that curators fell ill, that unexplained misfortunes haunted those responsible for the artifact's transport. Whether these were true or not, they showed how the curse endured, ready to awaken whenever Tutankhamun's treasures crossed new thresholds. Howard Carter himself could never fully escape the shadow of the curse. Though he outlived many of his colleagues, his name was always tied to the legend. Visitors to his home often asked him whether he feared the boy king's wrath. Then, though he dismissed such notions with a wave of his hand, one senses in his writings a quiet unease, a recognition that something larger than archaeology had been unleashed. Carter's journals described the tomb as breathtaking, haunting, and solemn. Even if he did not believe in a literal curse, he understood that he had trespassed into a sacred world. And perhaps that recognition was burden enough. The persistence of the curse reveals more about human nature than about Tutankhamun himself. Death, after all, is the one mystery none can escape, and to cloak it in legend is to make it bearable. The curse offered a narrative where misfortune was not random, but meaningful. Where death was not senseless, but tied to the will of a king who ruled even beyond the grave. It made tragedy comprehensible, and in doing so, it gave comfort even as it frightened. That is why the curse survived long after the names of most of its supposed victims were forgotten. It was never about individuals. It was about the story itself, the echo of a civilization that treated eternity with utmost seriousness. In Cairo, during those years, the legend of the curse spread like wildfire among both locals and foreigners. Egyptians, steeped in their own traditions of respect for the dead, felt vindicated by the tragedies that befell the intruders. Westerners, captivated by the exoticism of the desert and its ruins, embraced the story as a kind of modern fairy tale, terrifying, enthralling, and impossible to ignore. In this way, the curse bridged two worlds, carrying with it different meanings for different people. For Egyptians, it was justice. For Westerners, it was mystery. But for all, it was unforgettable. Some scientists in later decades even proposed physical explanations for the curse. They suggested that deadly molds, bacteria, or toxins might have lingered in the sealed air of the tomb, released when the chambers were opened after millennia. Such theories explained Carnarvon's infected mosquito bite, or the sudden illnesses that struck some of the team. Yet while these theories offered rational comfort, they could never fully dispel the aura of the supernatural. To say that microbes killed Carnarvon was plausible. To say that the pharaoh struck him down was powerful. And between plausibility and power, it was always the latter that captured human hearts. The curse also cast a long shadow over archaeology itself. Excavators in later decades often approached new tombs with a mixture of awe and caution, aware that the public's imagination would always look for signs of misfortune. Even today, when a new mummy or tomb is unearthed, whispers of curses rise anew, a testament to how deeply Tutankhamun's story embedded itself in the human psyche. The legend became a template. To disturb the dead is to invite their wrath, whether in Egypt, Peru, or China. In this way, the Boy King's resting place reshaped how the modern world thinks about the Ancient One. In truth, the curse was never fully about punishment. It was about reverence, about reminding the living that the dead deserve respect. The Egyptians themselves would have understood it that way. Their tombs were not designed as traps, but as sanctuaries, places where eternity was carefully constructed and preserved. Yet sanctuaries violated often become warnings. The curse, then, is not so much the vengeance of Tutankhamun as the echo of Egyptian belief itself, echoing across time to caution us that eternity is fragile, and those who tamper with it do so at their peril. And so the story carries us further from the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings into the modern world where Tutankhamun reigns as both legend and mystery. His mask still gleams, his treasures still draw millions, and his name still stirs whispers of the curse. Yet beneath the glitter lies something deeper, the voice of a civilization that spoke through stone, ritual, and silence, reminding us that death is never simple, that the past is never gone. As we drift onward, the tale will guide us not only through the curse itself, but through the broader mysteries of Tutankhamun's life, his death, and the enduring fascination he casts over all who dare to peer into his eternal gaze. To truly understand the legend of Tutankhamun's curse, we must look not only at the deaths of those who disturbed his tomb, but also at the mystery of the Boy King himself. His life was brief, his reign short, and his death sudden. Even his name was nearly forgotten until Carter's discovery. Yet the fragments of evidence left behind tell a story filled with intrigue, fragility, and the weight of dynastic expectation. Tutankhamun ascended to the throne as a child, perhaps no older than 9, and though he bore the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, real power lay with his advisors. Behind the golden mask was not a mighty warrior like Ramses the Great, or a builder of empires like Thutmose III, but a boy caught in the machinery of history. Modern science has attempted to unravel the enigma of his death, and in doing so has added fuel to the fascination surrounding him. Scans of his mummy revealed a broken leg, likely sustained shortly before his death, along with signs of severe malaria. Some scholars believe he died from complications of infection, while others point to possible genetic weaknesses, the result of generations of royal inbreeding. Still others whisper of darker causes, that Tutankhamun was murdered, struck down in a palace intrigue by those who sought power after his reign. Each theory carries with it a sense of unfinished story, and each deepens the mystery. For if the Boy King's death was violent, then the disturbance of his tomb becomes even more fraught, as though his spirit denied justice in life, demanded it in death. Examinations of his remains also suggest that Tutankhamun was not the picture of divine perfection his golden mask presents. He may have suffered from physical deformities, including a clubfoot and a curved spine, leaving him reliant on walking sticks, many of which were found in his tomb. The abundance of such objects suggests he struggled with mobility, and his life may have been marked by frailty rather than vigor. This vulnerability makes his tomb all the more striking, filled with chariots, and symbols of strength. It presents an image of power that his body may never have known. To disturb such a resting place, then, feels doubly cruel, as though the fragile boy had finally been granted dignity in death, only to have it stolen once again by strangers centuries later. The story of Tutankhamun's death is further complicated by the chaos that followed it. His widow, Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, found herself vulnerable in a court filled with ambitious men. She even wrote to a foreign king, the Hittite ruler Sepululiyama, begging for a husband to protect her throne. That letter, astonishing in its desperation, reveals the instability of the royal house after Tutankhamun's passing. The foreign prince sent to marry her was murdered before reaching Egypt, and Ankhesenamun herself disappears from history soon after. In this turbulent aftermath, Tutankhamun was buried in a hastily prepared tomb, smaller than one would expect for a pharaoh, suggesting his death was unexpected and arrangements rushed. This sense of incompleteness has always haunted his story, adding to the aura of mystery that surrounds his resting place. When Carter opened the tomb in 1922, he found not only treasures, but traces of hurried preparation. Walls were roughly plastered, chambers smaller than royal tradition, and objects crammed together as if space had run out. And yet, despite this, the tomb was rich beyond measure, filled with gold, alabaster, ivory, and precious stones. It was as if all the wealth of Egypt had been poured into this one small chamber to make up for the suddenness of the king's death. That combination, hastily arranged, yet dazzlingly furnished, gave the tomb an uncanny quality, as though it bore the fingerprints of both chaos and devotion. To disturb such a place was to disturb a delicate balance, and perhaps it is no wonder that tales of a curse arose so quickly. The mask itself, perhaps the most iconic artifact ever uncovered, embodies the paradox of Tutankhamun. Its serene face gazes outward, youthful and perfect, as if time itself cannot touch him. Inlaid with lapis lazuli and turquoise, it radiates an aura of immortality. Yet behind that mask lay a body broken and frail, a boy whose real life was likely filled with pain. The contrast is haunting, and perhaps this is why the mask exerts such power over those who see it. It does not merely represent Tutankhamun, it conceals him, transforming weakness into divinity. And in this transformation lies the tension of the curse. To pierce the mask, to look behind it, is to invite consequences. For the mask was never meant to be removed by mortal hands. Modern forensic tests have revealed even stranger details. Some argue that traces of fire damage exist on Tutankhamun's mummy, suggesting that a botched embalming process, combined with chemical reactions, may have caused his body to burn inside the coffin. If true, it would mean his burial was not only hurried but flawed, a disaster in Egyptian ritual terms. For a culture obsessed with perfection and funerary rites, such an error would have been catastrophic, risking the king's eternal peace. Perhaps then, the curse is not vengeance at all, but sorrow, the sorrow of a boy king whose death was hasty, whose burial was imperfect, and whose afterlife was threatened until modern intruders compounded the disruption. The tragedy of Tutankhamun's short life resonates even more strongly when set against the grandeur of his afterlife. In life, he was frail, overshadowed, and vulnerable. In death, he became immortal, his name spoken across the world, his mask a symbol of beauty, his treasures a marvel unmatched. And yet, this immortality came at a cost. His tomb violated, his body dissected by science, his peace disturbed. The curse, then, may be less about vengeance and more about the price of fame, the toll exacted when the living cannot resist the temptation to pry open eternity. In this way, the story of Tutankhamun becomes a mirror for us all. It asks what it means to disturb the dead, what it means to seek knowledge at any cost, what it means to turn a human life into a spectacle. The curse is the conscience of this story, the reminder that behind the golden legend was a boy who lived and died, who may have suffered, who was mourned, and who was laid to rest with care. To reduce him to treasure is to dishonor him, and the curse whispers that dishonor brings consequence. And yet, Tutankhamun himself might never have been remembered had his tomb not been discovered. Without Carter, without Carnarvon, without the myths of the curse, the boy king might have remained in obscurity, his name buried under centuries of sand. Instead, he is now the most famous of all pharaohs, known across every continent, his story retold in countless forms. Perhaps this, too, is part of the paradox. Perhaps the curse is also a gift, for in striking down those who trespassed, it ensured that Tutankhamun's story would never again be forgotten. In this sense, he reigns still, not in Egypt alone, but in the imagination of the entire world. The blending of history, science, and legend makes Tutankhamun unique among pharaohs. Ramses, Seti, and Thutmose built empires, fought wars, and raised colossal monuments. Yet none command the fascination of this boy who died before manhood. His power lies not in what he did, but in what was done to him, the way his death was hurried, his tomb hidden, his discovery sensational, and his memory entangled with myth. The curse is not an accessory to his story. It is the story, for it binds together his fragile life, his sudden death, his dazzling treasures, and his immortal fame. And so, the tale drifts onward, leaving behind the frailty of the boy king to return once more to the broader web of lives entangled with his tomb. The desert winds still whisper through the Valley of the Kings, the treasures still gleam under museum lights, and the curse still waits like a shadow just beyond reason. As we continue, we will follow its reach further. Into the years after Carter's discovery, into the ways the curse shaped not only lives but culture itself, becoming a story that transcends Egypt to belong to the entire world. By the mid-20th century, the legend of Tutankhamun's curse had escaped the boundaries of archaeology and taken on a life of its own. No longer confined to scholarly circles or the columns of newspapers, it entered the realm of art, literature, and cinema, where imagination could amplify what facts could not. Writers drew upon the story of the curse to weave tales of supernatural vengeance, of mummies that stirred from their wrappings to punish the living. In these stories, the pharaoh's wrath was no longer confined to whispers of coincidence. It was personified, dramatic, terrifying. The boy king, once frail and forgotten, became the archetype of a supernatural force, his shadow stretching into theaters, novels, and eventually onto the silver screen. Hollywood, always hungry for spectacle, was quick to embrace the imagery. In 1932, Universal Pictures released The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff as Imhotep, a fictional priest resurrected from the sands. Though not directly about Tutankhamun, the film drew its inspiration from the curse, feeding on the public's fascination with Egypt's dead and the dangers of disturbing them. Wrapped in bandages, stalking the living with silent menace, Karloff's mummy became an icon, and the connection between Egypt and curses was sealed in popular culture. From that moment onward, whenever the word mummy was uttered, the shadow of Tutankhamun's tomb was never far behind. The curse also inspired countless novels and short stories, each one embellishing the dangers of ancient tombs. Authors drew from the strange deaths linked to Carnarvon, Bethel, and others, transforming them into cautionary tales about greed and trespass. In these works, the tomb became a stage where modern arrogance met ancient power and where the dead always prevailed. The settings shifted from deserts to museums, from Egypt itself to far-off lands. But the theme remained the same. To disturb the eternal is to invite doom. In this way, the curse transcended history and became a mythological template, applicable anywhere that the past meets the present. Even outside fiction, the legend endured. In the 1970s, when Tutankhamun's treasures toured internationally, the curse was revived in headlines. Millions stood in line to glimpse the golden mask, yet newspapers continued to warn of ill fortune. Some claimed that accidents followed the exhibition, the curators collapsed mysteriously, that those who handled the treasures felt a weight beyond explanation. Whether these were exaggerations or simple accidents mattered little. The public whispered once more of the curse, and each retelling renewed its power. In this sense, Tutankhamun's curse was not an ancient spell, but a living story, one that thrived whenever his treasures crossed into new lands. Television and radio programs also kept the legend alive. Documentaries spoke of the curse in hushed tones, mixing archaeological fact with eerie speculation. Radio dramatizations retold the deaths of Carnarvon and others as if they were chapters of a Gothic novel. Even children's books filled with pictures of pyramids and golden masks could not resist mentioning the curse, presenting it as a mysterious footnote that made Egypt all the more enchanting. By the late 20th century, the curse had become inseparable from Tutankhamun's identity, woven so deeply into his story that one could not be told without the other. The influence of the curse extended beyond art into psychology. Scholars pointed out that the belief in curses often creates its own reality. Fear can weaken the body, making illness more likely. Anxiety can make accidents more common. Some suggested that those who believed themselves cursed might indeed fall victim to their own minds, a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. This explanation did little to diminish the story, however. For many, the very fact that belief could kill was proof enough that the curse was real. Whether by supernatural means or by the frailty of the human spirit, Egypt itself benefited from the fascination. Tourism surged as visitors from around the world flocked to the Valley of the Kings, eager to stand where Carter once stood, to look upon the same cliffs and imagine the same silence. Guides told the story of the curse with practiced voices, their words tinged with both pride and warning. For Egypt, the curse was not a stain, but a gift, drawing attention and awe. A reminder that its ancient civilization still commanded respect and wonder. In this way, the boy king continued to rule not with armies or decrees, but with mystery. Yet the curse was not always presented as a tale of fear. Some saw it instead as a message of reverence, a way of reminding the modern world that the past is sacred. Museums that displayed Tutankhamun's treasures often noted how visitors fell silent in his presence, as if sensing an invisible weight. The golden mask, the statues, the chariots all seemed to radiate an aura that words could not capture. In those moments, the curse was not about punishment, but about humility, the gentle reminder that eternity deserves respect. Even science could not banish the legend. In 2002, researchers tested the mummies of Egypt for signs of dangerous fungi and bacteria, hoping to explain the curse as a matter of spores and toxins. Though they found some microbes capable of causing illness, the evidence was not definitive. The rational explanation remained plausible but incomplete, leaving room for mystery to survive. For if the curse could not be fully explained, then it could not be fully dismissed, and so it lingered, haunting the edge of reason like a shadow just beyond the torchlight. Popular culture continued to reinvent the curse for new generations. Films in the late 20th and early 21st centuries revived the mummy as an icon of horror and adventure. Video games, television shows, and novels all returned to the theme of cursed tombs, keeping Tutankhamun's shadow alive in the imagination of millions, who might never have heard the full story of Carter and Carnarvon. Each retelling stripped away details and added new ones, but the heart of the legend remained. To disturb the dead is to invite consequences. The Boy King's story, retold in countless forms, ensured that his curse would never fade. And still, beneath the layers of fiction, the real Tutankhamun lingers. The boy who walked with a cane, who wore gold sandals in life and in death, who may have suffered illness and frailty, is hidden behind the mask of legend. Perhaps this is the final irony of the curse, that Tutankhamun himself is forever obscured by it, transformed into an eternal symbol rather than remembered as a human being. The curse immortalized him, but at the cost of his individuality. He is now less a king than an archetype, less a boy than a myth. And so, the story moves toward its end, carrying us gently into the last part of our journey. The curse of Tutankhamun has spanned a century. From the sands of the Valley of the Kings to the bright lights of cinema, from whispered omens to scientific investigations, it has taken on many forms: fear, reverence, legend, and entertainment, but through it all, the Boy King's shadow endures. As we drift into the final chapter, we will reflect not only on the strange deaths and mysteries, but on what the curse truly means, and why it still holds us in its grip long after the desert first gave up its secret. Nearly a century has passed since Howard Carter first gazed through the small hole in the doorway and whispered that he saw wonderful things. In those 100 years, Tutankhamun has become more than a boy king. It's more than a pharaoh, more than even a symbol of Egypt itself. He has become a mirror for humanity's eternal fascination with death, mystery, and the unseen. His treasures, dazzling under museum lights, continue to draw millions, and his mask, serene and timeless, remains one of the most recognized objects on Earth. Yet alongside the splendor of gold and jewels lingers the shadow of the curse, a whisper that refuses to die, as if the desert itself insists that some mysteries must never be fully explained. The curse has outlived its supposed victims, outlasted the skeptics, and endured far beyond the headlines that first carried it. It has become part of our collective imagination. A story retold again and again in films, novels, exhibitions, and quiet conversations. Each new generation hears it afresh, and each finds in it something different. A warning about greed, a reminder of mortality, a thrill of the supernatural. In this way, the curse has become immortal, not as a supernatural force perhaps, but as a story. And stories are the most enduring of all treasures. The Egyptians themselves knew this, for they carved their myths into stone so that they would outlive empires. Tutankhamun's curse, whether born of coincidence or imagination, has achieved the same immortality. For those who believe, the curse is a sign that the ancient Egyptians succeeded in their quest to protect eternity. Their warnings, etched in stone and whispered in ritual, still echo across time, punishing the living when they trespass too far into the realm of the dead. For those who doubt, the curse is a reminder of how human minds weave meaning from chaos, how tragedy becomes myth, and myth becomes truth in the telling. Between belief and doubt lies the mystery, and it is in that space that the curse lives, not needing to be proven to be powerful. The Valley of the Kings still lies under the same silent sky it has always known. The cliffs still stand in solemn silence. The air still carries the dry scent of stone and sand. And the tombs remain like veins cut into the earth, holding stories as fragile as they are eternal. To stand there today is to feel the same weight Carter felt, the same hush of unseen eyes, the same sense that one is walking between two worlds. The curse is not bound to a list of names, and death's it is bound to that silence, to that feeling, to the recognition that eternity is not ours to disturb without consequence. Tutankhamun himself, fragile and broken in life, has become immortal through this story. His legacy is not measured in battles won or temples raised, but in the way his resting place captured the world's imagination. In this sense, the curse may be his greatest triumph, for it has ensured that his name will never be forgotten. In a civilization that placed the highest value on remembrance, on the continued speaking of one's name as a path to eternal life, Tutankhamun has achieved what few kings ever could. His name is on every tongue, his mask in every memory, his story in every imagination. Perhaps, then, the curse is not vengeance, but balance. The boy king was hurried into a small tomb, denied the grandeur usually afforded to pharaohs. And yet, in death, he received a kind of justice. The world itself became his temple. Story became his monument, his mask, his eternal face. Those who trespassed upon his rest paid with illness, misfortune, or the burden of a legend they could never escape. In that sense, the curse is not punishment, but restoration. A cosmic balancing of scales that ensured the boy who was overlooked in life would reign forever in death. The treasures of Tutankhamun still travel, still inspire awe, still stir whispers of fear. Visitors gaze upon his mask in hushed silence, often lowering their voices without knowing why. It is as if the aura of eternity lingers in the gold and lapis. It's the same aura that once filled the dark tomb when Carter first lit his candle. That hush, that quiet reverence, is perhaps the real curse, not death or misfortune. But the way the boy king still commands respect across 3 millennia, the silence that follows his treasures wherever they go, is a silence of recognition. Silence that binds us to the same awe the ancient Egyptians once felt for their pharaohs. The curse also teaches us something about ourselves, that we crave mystery. We need stories larger than logic, that we long to believe the past still has power over the present. In the end, the curse is as much a creation of the modern world as of the ancient one. It is the fusion of ancient belief with modern imagination, a testament to the way stories live on when facts fade. Tutankhamun's tomb gave us gold, but it also gave us a legend, and it is the legend that endures most strongly. As we reflect on the long list of names tied to the cursed Carnarvon, Gould Bethel, Westbury, Mace, we see not only tragedy, but the way tragedy became myth. Each life lost became another stone in the monument of the curse, another offering to the legend of the Boy King. And as much as scholars dismiss the idea, the truth is that the curse has endured because it speaks to something deep in the human heart, the recognition that the dead deserve peace, that to violate that peace is to risk more than we can understand. And yet, for all its shadows, the story of the curse is also filled with light. It reminds us of the brilliance of Egyptian civilization, of the devotion with which they prepared for eternity, of the artistry that filled Tutankhamun's tomb with treasures still dazzling today. It reminds us that life is fragile and fleeting, but that memory can be eternal. It reminds us that mystery has its own power, a power that logic cannot erase. In this way, the curse is not merely a warning but a gift, binding us more closely to the humanity of those who lived and died thousands of years ago. And so we come to the end of our journey. The curse of Tutankhamun remains, not as a chain of misfortunes, but as a whisper carried on desert winds, as a shadow beneath museum lights, as a story told again and again in voices hushed with awe. The Boy King's resting place, once hidden, is now eternal in another way, eternal in our imagination. Whether one believes in the curse or not, its presence lingers, like the flicker of a candle in the dark, like the echo of footsteps in a chamber long sealed. In that silence, in that mystery, we find not fear but wonder. And so, as the story draws to its close, let your mind drift gently with it, as though carried upon the Nile at night. Stars reflecting in the water, desert cliffs, silent under the moon. The curse of Tutankhamun is not only about death, but about eternity, about the fragile line between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. And as you rest now, you may carry with you the quiet knowledge that some mysteries endure forever, that the Boy King still reigns in silence, and that the desert still whispers his name across the endless sands. Sleep softly, for the story has not ended. It continues, always, in the hush of eternity.